עוסק בנושא, הוא יעסוק בנושא מהי המשמעות להיות נזיר מביתא ישראל. בחינת הקיום הפיזי של חברים בתנועת הנזירות של ביתא ישראל באתיופיה. אני רוצה לומר, מבחינת הרשמים שלי, כשעסקתי במחקר המקיף על הקייסים, כלומר כהני הדת של יהודי אתיופיה במשך כ3 שנים, אז התוודעתי לראשונה למושג של נזירות, של קייסים שלמדו באתיופיה. הקייסים, היום יש בישראל בערך כ20 קייסים מבוגרים שעברו את ההכשרה שלהם באתיופיה, וכולם סיפרו לי במהלך המחקר על תהליך הכשרה במנזר, על ידי הדרכה של נזיר, במשך תקופה מסוימת. כלומר, לא כל תהליך הסוציאליזציה שלהם על ידי נזיר, הם התחילו מגיל 6-7 ללמוד בקהילה המקומית, תחת קייס, מישהו במשפחה, אבל אחר כך הם עברו למוסד הנזירות, והמושג הזה באמת יעניין אותנו לשמוע, לקבל עליו יותר פרטים. בר קריבוס הוא דוקטורנט במכון לארכיאולוגיה של האוניברסיטה העברית בירושלים. מחקרו מתמקד בארכיאולוגיה האתיופית של התקופה האקסומית בשל ימי הביניים, וכן בהיסטוריה ובתרבות החומרית של יהודי אתיופיה. עבודת המחקר שלו עוסקת בתנועת הנזירות של יהודי אתיופיה, עם דגש על חיי היום-יום של הנזירים ועל המנזרים שבהם הם התגוררו. מרכיב מרכזי במחקר הוא סקר ארכיאולוגי של שרידי מנזרים של יהודים באתיופיה. בבקשה.
I'm going to speak in English, and I'm going to talk about the daily lives of the Beta Israel monks, the Beta Israel monastic movement. At least in my opinion, the monastic movement of the Beta Israel is one of the most amazing, interesting aspects of their history and heritage. It's not that well known, and while Beta Israel liturgy, and specifically the liturgy of the monks, has been studied and published, very little else about the Beta Israel monastic movement has been extensively studied. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Yad Yitzchak Ben-Zvi, the ERC project Jews East, the Center for Study of Christianity at the Hebrew University, the Ruth Amiran Fund for Archaeological Research in Eretz Israel, and the Mandel School for Advanced Studies in the Humanities, all of which are supporting my research. Before we dive into the specifics of what it actually meant to be a Beta Israel monk, it's important to give a little bit of a background of what this monastic movement actually is and what its beginnings were. So usually when people hear about Jewish monasticism, and this is to my knowledge the only example of Jewish monasticism from medieval and modern times, they think about the Nezirut, the Jewish asceticism that's discussed in the Bible, or Jewish asceticism that we know existed in Roman Second Temple period times. But it's important to say from the start that the monasticism of the Beta Israel, the Ethiopian Jews, was very similar to the Christian model of monasticism. The monks were called menokse or melokse, which derives from the Greek monachos, the same term that the English word monk is derived from. They lived in monasteries, they were celibate, they didn't marry, they didn't have children, and they devoted their lives to prayer and practiced different ascetic practices. And in general, it's important to say that when we think about Judaism and Christianity in Ethiopia, the concepts are maybe a little bit different from what we usually think about when we imagine Judaism and Christianity in different places in the world. So for example, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church practices circumcision on the 8th day of a child's life. They celebrate Saturday in addition to Sunday as a holy day. They adhere to biblical dietary laws. They don't eat pork, which is a big plus if you're an Israeli traveling in Ethiopia. In their churches, aside from the priests, they also have the Debterot, who are sort of parallel to the biblical Levites in that their role is to play holy music. And Ethiopian Christians in general and their ruling line in particular claim Israelite descent. And if you look at the Ethiopian Jews, their liturgical language was and still is Gez, the Christian Ethiopian liturgical language. Most of their religious texts are to some extent derived from the religious texts of the Ethiopian Church. Their religious hierarchy, and we'll get into that further ahead, mirrors that of the Ethiopian church, and this might be a little less unusual. Their mesgids or synagogues were similar in form to contemporary Ethiopian churches. So there are a lot of similarities. Another thing that's important to say from the start is that when we look into Beta Israel monasticism, we're looking to something that to a large extent doesn't exist anymore, but did exist in the recent past. Beta Israel monasticism started declining in the second half of the 19th century, and reasons were the meeting between the Beta Israel and Christian missionaries who criticized Jewish monasticism, and also representatives of world Jewry who criticized Christian monasticism and taught a new generation of Beta Israel how to be properly Jewish and abandon some of the old ways. Famine and invasions from the end of the 19th century that severely that caused the Jewish population to shrink drastically, and less and less people could afford to live a celibate life. And the process leading to the immigration of the Beta Israel to Israel, which in the process also caused them to transform their religious life and conform more to religious life in Israel. When we want to learn about this type of monasticism, there are several sources of information. Unfortunately, the Beta Israel themselves, except for a few small exceptions, didn't write their own history until recently. So we have descriptions written by Westerners who came in contact with the Beta Israel. Some of these were missionaries, some representatives of world Jewry, and some of these were scholars. We have the Beta Israel oral tradition, and in addition to that, we also have the testimony of people who had the privilege of studying in Beta Israel monasteries, which is a very important source of information. And we also have the archaeological finds, and in December of last year, I was lucky to go on a first field season along with Dr. Verena Krebs from the Hebrew University, and we didn't have a chance to travel much in the area where the monasteries existed, but we did have a chance to examine one site, which is probably a site of a Beta Israel monastery. So it's a promising beginning for the search for Beta Israel monasteries. Now, if we look for the origins of Beta Israel monasticism, there are mentions of Christian monks in Ethiopian Christian hagiographies who came in contact with groups labeled as Jews. One of these mentions talks about a monk called Cosmos, who rebelled against his local monastic community, joined a Jewish group, wrote the Torah for them, and led them in a struggle against the Christians in the area. The Beta Israel oral tradition recognizes a man called Abba Sabra as the founder of the monastic movement. One version of the tradition states that he was a Christian who converted to Judaism. The other states that he was originally Jewish. Both of them state that he befriended the son of the Ethiopian emperor Zara Yaakov, and at some point they were forced to flee the royal court. They traveled to a mountain called Hoharua or Huhwara, and there in a cave they founded the first Ethiopian Jewish monastery. And just to show you that his legacy is still recognized today, this is the entrance to the Abba Sabra synagogue in Be'er Sheva. When we look at the religious hierarchy of Beta Israel as it was in Ethiopia, it's very different from the hierarchy that we see today in Israel, because there were still monks around. We have the monks at the top of the hierarchy. They trained and consecrated the kesoch, or the priests. And there were also deacons, who were people training to be religious clergy but not yet consecrated, and defteras, who were people who had received training but were not consecrated as religious clergy. In a reality with no monks, nowadays we have the head priest, or the lika kahanat, the head of the kesoch, and below him the kesoch. But very recently, a student of the only Beta Israel monk to immigrate to Israel has become a practicing monk, and he's recognized by some as a parallel leader of the religious hierarchy. So this might also be changing nowadays. And just to give you a glimpse at reality before all these religious changes, the missionary Flad writes in the second half of the 19th century, these priests, he's talking about the kesoch, the priests, are found in villages where there are no monks. They are commissioned by the monks to observe the various ceremonies of religious worship. To qualify them for this office, it is necessary that they should be of good repute in a monastic point of view. So it's quite different from what we have in Israel today. When we think about the roles of the monks, what they meant to the community, the monks were the supreme leaders of the Beta Israel, both in religious matters and also in non-religious matters. They were credited with writing much of and shaping the liturgy, the prayers, and they were also those who trained and consecrated the priests, the lay clergy. And there was also a system of hierarchy within the monastic order. So for instance, Feitlovich, in the early 20th century, visits the Beta Israel monastery at Goraba and writes, at the head of the priests, and he's talking about monks in this case, is an old, respected 90-year-old man. His name is Abba Arian, and he is also the head of the community. So we have the lay community, the monastic community living next to them and also leading them, and we have one monk at the head of the monastery. Halevi, who visits in the second half of the 19th century, writes that in the different provinces there were monks who stood up, who led the other monks in the provinces. So we have a division into provinces. And Flad, also writing in the second half of the 19th century, writes that each province is led by a monk, and one specific monk leads all the monks from the different provinces. So we have a complete hierarchical system through which the Beta Israel could govern themselves and maintain contact with one another. Another interesting question is who chose to become a monk? And we have, there were a number of options. One option was a young child could choose to receive religious instruction and go to a monastery. There are also mentions of children who their parents chose a monastic or a lay clergy career for them. And there are also indications that some elderly people chose to spend their retirement as monks and live closer to God in their last years. Another fascinating question is the question of Beta Israel nuns. If there were monks, were there nuns? There are several eyewitness accounts of Beta Israel nuns. They are almost never described as living together in a large community. And it's very interesting nowadays, at least the Kesoch that I've spoken to have no recollection of Beta Israel nuns ever existing. So either there were few, maybe they chose not to remember them, maybe they weren't as significant as the monks, or maybe they weren't officially consecrated into the monastic order. One example is a tradition written down by Tamrat Immanuel that talks about a nun called Emma Endita, who was a friend of animals, and one day she met a lion with a splinter in its paw, and she took out the splinter and mended the paw, and the lion became her friend. So for those of you dealing in hagiography, this is a story that might be familiar. Beta Israel monasteries, in addition to being the dwelling places of the monks, also served as religious schools. What you see here is the only picture that I could find of part of a Beta Israel monastery. It was taken by Leslau in 1949, and since he only mentions visiting one monastery, the monastery of Acherge, I assume that this is taken from that monastery. You can see sitting down 3 monks, and standing up 2 of the children, probably the ones studying under them, and in the background one of their dwellings. According to Kes Adisu Bainasai from Yavne and Kes Samai Elias from Rishon, religious instruction could begin at the age of 7, and from the ages of 13 to 15, the young boys could go and live in a monastery for the next phase of their religious instructions. Theoretically, if they were good enough, from the age of 20 they could be consecrated, and when they were consecrated they could choose. Either they would marry, have children, and return to lay society, and they would become priests, or they would remain unmarried, live in a monastery, and be monks. So both priests and monks received the same religious education for the same length of time, but monks, due to their decision to leave everyday life and live in a monastic community, were considered much higher spiritually. Here we have a description of their religious education written by Flad in the second half of the 19th century. He also talks about an initiation ceremony that's officially held to welcome the new monks or priests into their new role. When we think about monks, usually we think about ascetic practices, and Beta Israel monks were not unusual in this respect. So we have Flad writing, the Falasha monks undergo severe fasting and mortification. Many of them retire into deserts. There are no deserts in the areas where they live. Usually when the word desert is used, it means wilderness, where they subsist on herbs and roots and sometimes die of hunger. So from the sources I've examined so far, it's evident that their ascetics practices included fasting, included a selective diet. There were things that they could eat, there were things that they couldn't eat. And maybe the clearest manifestation of their ascetic practices were their severe purity rites. That's another element of their monasticism that really stands out. Stern, another missionary writing in the second half of the 19th century, writes, "The dwellings and convents of these ascetics are carefully isolated from the abodes of the impure and unholy people. Nay, as every contact with a common herd communicates contamination and involves laborious lavations of body and dress, they will not eat, drink, or sleep in their houses. Even their fields must be cultivated and harvest reaped, and the bread prepared by themselves or younger monks." So they could not come in physical contact with anybody from the lay community. They would live in a separate, enclosed enclosure. They had to prepare their own food. And that's one of the main components that I'm looking for when I'm looking for the monasteries. Usually, or maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, one element of the monasteries is an enclosure fence or an enclosure wall that could be built either from thorns or from stone, or in one description describes a monastery enclosed by a circle of stones. And this is not a picture of a monastery. This is a picture of a hut that the women in the Beta Israel community spent their monthly periods in. It was a period when it was a time when they were considered impure and they had to live separately, but it's also separated from public space by a circle of stone. So this might be a similar phenomenon. The monks living in a monastery doesn't necessarily mean that they never exited the monastery. Leslau writes, after his visit to a monastery in 1949, "The monks and their servants work in the field and prepare their own food and drink. After working with other men, so there was some sort of contact, they wash out the clothes they have been wearing and change to other clothes." One interesting element of the monastic separation from the rest of the world is the element of how their students interacted with them. In order to enter a monastery and receive religious instructions, the students had to wait outside the monastery for 7 days, and in these 7 days immerse themselves in water to purify themselves, and also eat only uncooked chickpeas soaked in water. And this is an example of some of the chickpeas growing near what might be a monastery site. Only after that they could enter, and whenever they wanted to visit their families, and they wouldn't do that frequently, they would have to undergo the same week of purification before going back inside the monastery to continue their religious instruction. So it was a big deal to enter a monastery and learn from the monks. From the sources that I've examined so far, I've tried to divide the monasteries into different types so that I know what to look for. One type that stands out I've called the village monastery, because it was built either within or on the outskirts of a village and separated from the rest of the village by an enclosure fence or wall. Here you have an example, the monastery at Achelge. Another one you could label an isolated monastery. It was built not too far away from Beta Israel villages, but on a bit detached from the villages on a mountaintop. One important difference was, in a village monastery, the mesgid, the prayer house, was shared by the monastic and the lay community. And in an isolated monastery, because it wasn't within a village, the monastic community had its own prayer house. You have another example. There were also monks who would go into the wilderness for periods of isolation, but at least the sources that I've found and examined so far state that the monks left the monastic community and also returned to a monastic community in the end. So I don't think there were monks that decided to live their entire lives alone in the wilderness. This is just an example of some of the monasteries that I was, I hope, able to pinpoint on a map to show you that there were monasteries in almost all areas inhabited by the Beta Israel, and that the information that can be gathered today can allow for exact pinpointing of the monastic sites. The prayer house, in cases when the monastery was situated within or near villages, had to provide a solution that enabled monks and laymen to pray together in the same structure. On the right you have the plan of a typical Ethiopian church. On the left you have a plan of a typical Beta Israel synagogue. You can see that they are similar, but there are differences. For instance, in the synagogue you can see the sacrificial altar outside the structure. The Beta Israel would conduct sacrifices up until recently. In cases when a monastic community lived together with the lay community, the synagogue was divided by a wall, and there were separate entrances for the monks and for the lay community, so they could pray in the same structure without coming in contact one with the other. Another interesting issue is the issue of economy in the monasteries. How did the monks make a living? They had a few sources of income. One was the monks and the priests were considered by the Beta Israel to be maybe the unofficial heirs of the biblical priests, in that the community would give them a percentage of their crops. So that was one way that the monks could make an income, but there are several descriptions of the monks working in fields as farmers, and also of the monks manufacturing different objects and selling them. So they had to make their living in a similar way to the other people in the Beta Israel community. And another interesting aspect is the aspect of land ownership. This is very interesting because in Christian monastic communities, a very central element of monastery economy was the monastery's ownership of land and right to tax different portions of land. Beta Israel, or at least many of the Beta Israel, lost their rights to own land in the process of the battles between the Beta Israel and the Ethiopian Christians. So did Beta Israel monasteries own land? I could only find one source that might allude to this. This was written by Feitlovich in the early 20th century, and he writes about the main Beta Israel monastery at Hochwara. In the past, the Falashas in Hochwara were farmers owning their own land. Now they are left with only a few small plots in the mountains, recognized by the government as a property of the temple. And when he writes temple, what he actually means is the main synagogue in the monastery. These plots are cultivated mainly by priests who are sustained by them, but together with them work with lay falasha farmers. So to conclude, in this examination, I've tried to pinpoint some of the unique qualities of Beta Israel monasticism. And one of these unique qualities is them being a monastic movement that leads a religious group, but also leads a people in general. I know of no other example of a people being led by a monastic group. Another interesting example is the consecration of priests. In the Christian church, there are monks who are consecrated as priests and bishops and so on, and could consecrate clergy. But these were two parallel systems. Somebody could be an unconsecrated monk and still be a monk and still be a monastic leader. In the Beta Israel model, all monks, by the virtue of them being monks, are above the priests in the religious hierarchy and consecrate and oversee the work of the priests. Another interesting aspect are the purity laws, which are unparalleled in other segments of Ethiopian society. Ethiopian Christian monks do observe a number of purity laws, but they are nothing like the laws observed by the Beta Israel monks. This might not be completely unusual, but because the Beta Israel monks were the leaders of the community, their monasteries were designed in a way that enabled them to keep their purity laws, but still come in frequent contact with the lay community. It maybe goes without saying, but it is remarkable that we have a monastic movement that reminds us a lot of Christian monastic movement, but it championed the Jewish identity of the Beta Israel. And when Christian missionaries began an effort to convert the Beta Israel to Christianity, their main opponents were the monks, the only ones who had enough religious knowledge and enough motivation to oppose them and maintain the religious identity of the Beta Israel throughout the ages. So I'll end with a quote from an interview with a member of the Beta Israel community who said, these monks in Ethiopia, I think it really helped the Beta Israel exist. They taught the laws of the Torah, taught the priests, and I think it is due to them that the Beta Israel survived. Thanks.
Thank you very much. המרצה השני הוא דוקטור דוד רטנר. הוא ידבר על המאבק שנשכח, נרטיבים ביוגרפיים של ישראלים יוצאי אתיופיה, לשעבר לוחמים ופעילים פוליטיים בתקופת מלחמת האזרחים באתיופיה בשנים 1974-1991. דוקטור דוד רטנר הוא בעל תואר דוקטור מאוניברסיטת תל אביב. עבודת הדוקטורט שלו עסקה בטעמים מוזיקליים ובזהות בקרב צעירים יוצאי אתיופיה בישראל. לאחרונה מחקר זה פורסם בהוצאת רסלינג תחת הכותרת שומעים שחור, מוזיקה וזהות בקרב צעירים יוצאי אתיופיה בישראל. לאחרונה עוסק דוקטור רטנר בחקר של נרטיבים ביוגרפיים של יהודי אתיופיה בדגש על תקופת המהפכה ומלחמת האזרחים באתיופיה בשנים 1974-1991. את תוצאות מחקרו הוא יציג כאן. במקביל משמש דוקטור רטנר כראש מחקר ברמה, הרשות הארצית למדידה ולהערכה במשרד החינוך. בבקשה.
This session is titled Ethiopian Jews, the Forgotten History, and indeed I will be dealing with a chapter in the history of Ethiopian Jews that was almost completely disregarded and forgotten by the absorbing Israeli society. And I would also like to suggest that this is not only a question of history or of historical memory, but rather that it has also real-life consequences for this community and its position and place in Israeli society. I will start with a question. What do we really know about the newcomers from Ethiopia around the time of their arrival in Israel in the 80s and the 90s? And I'm not talking about the infamous debate about their origins in the distant past, neither about their religious practices. I'm talking about recent history and the personal biographies of members of this group prior to their arrival in Israel. I'm talking about their lives in the 70s, the 80s, and the early 90s. Those of us familiar with literature, both popular and academic, concerning the community might reach three conclusions. One, that generally speaking, their way of life remains static and changed only marginally throughout the decades and even the centuries prior to that period. Two, that Ethiopian Jews, formerly known as Beta Israel or Falasha, were very much disconnected from Ethiopian society, alienated from it, and persecuted by Ethiopians. And three, that their mental, ideological world was mostly, if not entirely, populated by religious beliefs and by the messianic longing for Jerusalem. On the other hand, there is another body of literature about general politics and historical events in Ethiopia at that period that seem to show a completely different image. An Ethiopian society that goes through dramatic and revolutionary changes, beginning with the turbulent period of demonstrations and strikes led by the student movement in the late 60s and the early 70s, the 74 revolution, the coming to power of the Derg military junta, the eruption of a civil war that lasted until 1991 when the Derg were overthrown. This huge difference between the two bodies of literature attracted my curiosity. Was it really the case that Ethiopian Jews were disconnected from all that was going on in Ethiopia at that period? I decided to start interviewing Ethiopian Jews, Israeli citizens nowadays, to try and look more deeply into this peculiar gap. I found out that not only the Jews were influenced by the political historical changes that swept Ethiopia, but that actually quite a few of them took an active part in the political struggles and in the historical events in Ethiopia at that period. Especially, they took part in two prominent political parties and revolutionary groups, the EPRP and the TPLF. The stories of these men and women are the focus of my talk, as well as the possible meanings of these stories for our understanding of this community and for their place in Israeli society. First, a short historical introduction. In the background, you can see a map of Ethiopia during the pre-revolutionary times. Eritrea was actually, unlike in this map, Eritrea was included inside Ethiopia. Later it became independent. Mostly what I will be talking about, much of the struggles appeared in the areas of Gondar in Tigray, and definitely in Eritrea, which you see on the top of the map, on the northern parts. And those are also the areas where the Beta Israel, the Falasha, especially Gondar and the Tigray, those were the areas where they resided. First, about the EPRP. The EPRP, Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Party, in Amharic Ethiopia, Hizbawi Abiyotawi Party, EHAPA, was the most promising, the most prominent political party in the first period before and after the 74 revolution. Its founders were leaders of the student movement, and many came from universities abroad. In accordance with the spirit of the times, the EPRP was a Marxist-Leninist party, but also incorporated ideas of freedom, equality, democracy, and justice. A central practice of the EPRP was creating a net of underground cells of 4 to 5 members who met secretly and regularly for the purpose of studying revolutionary texts, as well as conducting acts of propaganda and mobilization. The popularity of the EPRP was so immense that even among highly ranked state officials, as well as among members of the Derg, there was, the Derg is the military junta, there were those who secretly participated in EPRP cells, or supported it. After the 74 revolution, EPRP was not ready to accept the Derg's authority, called the military junta fascists, and demanded a popular government to be established. Pretty soon, a direct confrontation erupted between the EPRP and the Derg. The Derg declared officially a campaign of red terror, Chai Sheber, in Amharic. There was this famous scene when Mengistu Haile Mariam smashing bottles of red liquid and declares, we start now a campaign of red terror. And it was a dreadful campaign indeed. They used to imprison young students who were suspected of being part of the EPRP or other organization, torture them, demand that they give away their friends and family, and execute them. In a matter of months, the entire infrastructure of the EPRP in city centers was destroyed. Parallel to their urban struggle, the EPRP launched, which the urban struggle was mostly in Addis Ababa, also in other city centers like Gondar and elsewhere. But parallel, they launched a military struggle from the rural areas of Tigray in northern Ethiopia. They started practicing guerrilla warfare in a Maoist tradition, and they were pretty successful in the beginning, but then they had a confrontation with another new rebel army, the TPLF, Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, who the TPLF defeated the EPRP in Tigray, drove them out of Tigray, and after that, they entered a stage of crisis, and as of 1980, it was de facto dismantled, and many of its members fled to the Sudan as refugees. The TPLF, Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, also started to operate in Tigray in 1975. The founders, they were also Marxist-Leninist by definition at least, but they also played the card of local identity, of Tigrayan local identity, which gave them much support from the local people, and they were more successful than the EPRP. First, they beat EPRP, they beat other rebel armies, including the EDU, Ethiopian Democratic Union, which came from the Sudan and was heavily supported by the Americans and Saudis, and the EDU were very well funded, but the TPLF beat them. And then they entered to a very long struggle of 70 years against the Derg, the military junta. They joined forces with the EPLF, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front that fought from Eritrea. I mean, this sort of communion had its ups and downs, but eventually they succeeded to joining forces and beating the Derg. In 1991, the TPLF entered Addis Ababa, and the new era dawned on Ethiopia, the rule of the TPLF. Well, the TPLF, they had very severe discipline in their ranks. I will not go into this. Okay, so this was really a short introduction about Ethiopian politics and civil war. And now the question, what does all this have to do with Ethiopian Jews, formerly known as Beta Israel or Falasha? According to previous research as well as popular literature, very little. All these dramatic events and processes were shown at best as unrelated to this group, or at worst as representing more trouble and misery for the wretched community that was persecuted and hated already. based on not too many, it's an ongoing project, but so far I conducted 17 in-depth interviews. I would like to suggest that there is another story hiding behind this one, a story of Ethiopian Jews who are deeply involved in these organizations and the dramatic events. Out of the 78 are former members of EPRP and the rest of the TPLF. Typically members of EPRP were active in the 70s, left the organization with its de facto dissolution in 1980, and after a period in Sudan they arrived in Israel. Members of the TPLF usually joined the organization during the 80s and served in its ranks until the victory in 1991 and several years beyond. They arrived in Israel in the late 90s and beyond. They were in different positions in those organizations. Some were fighters, some were political activists, they call themselves commissars, etc. But what is, besides the variation in roles, etc., there was one central feature that united them all, the way their personal biographies were intertwined in the greater story of Ethiopian revolution and civil war in the 70s and the 80s. Cumulatively, it seems that everything I described before and much more that I couldn't go in detail, they were part of. They were part of the underground cells and reading groups. They read at the age as early as 14, 15, 16. They were reading Marx and Mao and the Vietnamese revolutionaries, etc., who were their central inspiration. Some of them were not only in reading groups, some of them were publishers. They secretly, clandestinely wrote and printed and published leaflets and you might call them newspapers for the people in great danger, great risk for their lives. Etc. Many of them were fighters, some of them were dispatched in Eritrea. The worst fighting was going on in Eritrea for many years, including the using of chemical weapons and jets and artillery. And some of the people I interviewed who were TPLF members, they had to survive all this. It was very, very hard and lengthy war. When looking deeper into their stories, just for 1 second, let's join faces to those groups I was talking about. On the top left, we see Isaias Afewerki, the leader of EPLF, Eritrean People's Liberation Front, and nowadays it's a controversial president. Down here on the left, we see Mengistu Haile Mariam, the leader of the Derg, the military junta. To his right, we see Meles Zenawi, who eventually became the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, the head of TPLF until his death 4 years ago. And on the top right, one of the leaders of the EPRP, Berhane Meskel Rada, who tragically died in prison. So the three central themes that came up from the interviews. The first one was the interview's deep identification with universal and up-to-date ideology. Here we can see a testimony. I asked the person, okay, what were you fighting for? What were your ideals? And he said, and they had a very strong and clear vision. What were they fighting for? They were not, just used as soldiers for reasons they didn't understand. He said, we were very clear. One, we wanted land for the farmers. This was a big deal. Meret Larashu is one of the central slogans of all of revolutionary Ethiopia. 2, democratic rights to different groups, nations and nationalities. And 3, a democratic state. What particularly stood out was the all-inclusive ideology, an ideology of equality and non-discrimination to groups or individuals based on religion, ethnicity, nationality, or gender. Those ideals did not remain only theoretical, but rather were meticulously implemented in the ranks of the organizations, as the following example shows. As fighters in the EPRP, we might start thinking, maybe Jews were discriminated or other groups. That's what they say, and it goes throughout the interviews. as fighters in the EPRP, we didn't make differences between people. We didn't say you are a Jew and so on. We spoke about unity, about bringing all groups together. Those are different ethnic groups, Amhara, Oromo, Kemant, etc. They knew that I was a Jew, but it wasn't an issue, never was an issue at all. The second theme is their deep solidarity with Ethiopia and with the organizations they were part of. One of the strongest exemplification of this deep commitment was when they knew they had a chance to leave all that behind, their positions in the rebel groups, and go to Israel to follow their family members, etc. And no, this is the second quote. But some had the chance. They said that they knew of the chance, but we were not ready to leave. Okay. When looking back at this period, all the interviews expressed the utter importance of this period, both for them personally and for Ethiopia in general. As we can see in those two examples, do you miss this period? Very much. This is the university of my life. I'm a person who wants to make a difference, and it helped me enormously on the personal level. And the second quote, where he says, all the time my body is there. Every day I remember my friends, the friends who died. More than my family in Ethiopia, I remember my friends who fought together with me. This was very hard for me, but I'm happy that we fought and won and brought democracy to Ethiopia. Some would question whether it is a real democracy, but that's another question. When they show on Ethiopian TV my friends from the TPLF that died, I cry all night. And the third and last theme I will address is the forced, or well, maybe forced is too harsh, but the abandonment of the revolutionary ideology in politics after arrival in Israel. One of them says, when we arrived in June, it was 1981, I believe, and in November there was a publication in the newspaper that young communists had arrived, and so the Jewish agencies sent people to look after them, after us. Agents, translator, I don't exactly remember, but there was a sense of fear to speak about it, so they had to leave it behind. Although before this it was a very central part of their lives and the identity and the ideology, etc. But in the next quote we see that not everything was left behind, and there was some interesting continuations. Like it was in the underground in Ethiopia, that there were cells. I arranged here in Israel a cell as well. In each absorption center, I arranged a cell of activists. All was done to promote the cause of Ethiopian Jews. Before arriving in the absorption center, I called the activists by phone. They would arrange everything. We would set the time of arrival, and they arranged the people, and then I would come and make a speech. We also had a youth organization, an organization for the elderly, very similar to the way it was in the EPRP. Maybe it is a little bit exaggerated because, of course, EPRP was a very successful and all-inclusive Ethiopian movement, but here, this one person, by the way, all names are pseudonyms, but this specific person, he was a central figure in the fight, in the struggle of Ethiopian Jews in Israel, and here we can see how the practices, the organizational practices, were copied from there, at least to some degree, to Israel. Okay, so now I would like to discuss the question, what are the meanings of all that for our understanding of the Israel-Ethiopian community and their lives in Israel? First, of course, as historians, I don't need to tell you how important is history or official historical narrative to a society, who sets this narrative, what gets included, and what is left outside. Okay, so it seems that the official historical narrative concerning Ethiopian Jews in Ethiopia, while still in Ethiopia, was constructed by the absorbing society on three major pillars. The Ethiopian Jews' static way of life that changed only marginally, their detachment from Ethiopian society, and constant persecution by other groups, and the community's mental, ideological, I don't know how to call it really, world is being populated exclusively by Jewish religion, albeit in its unique Beta Israel form, and by the messianic longing for Jerusalem. This narrative crystallized, I would like to suggest that it crystallized a one-dimensional image of stagnation, of backwardness and detachment. Although this narrative was supposed to help the community enter more smoothly into the Israeli Jewish collective, it was actually a disservice, a trap that crystallized an image of their past that presented them in an unflattering light. The biographical narrative presented here seemed to challenge all three pillars of this deterministic narrative. They tell of a very dynamic period that saw dramatic changes in traditional authority and the rise of young generation of men and women with new and progressive ideas. The narratives are in no way those of detachment and estrangement from Ethiopia, but rather of powerful connection and solidarity with Ethiopia. The narratives show that the mental, conceptual, ideological world of Ethiopian Jews was not necessarily confined to the Beta Israel Holy Scriptures and traditions, neither to the aspiration of making a messianic pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The narrative here might suggest an alternative history, an alternative image of the Jewish community while still in Ethiopia, an image of dynamism, of ideological progressiveness, of commitment, of a universalist worldview, and of solidarity. It is my hope that this process of disclosure of the forgotten history will encourage a re-examination of the widespread imagery of the Ethiopian community in Israel and hopefully empower them in the long and bitter struggle for respect and acceptance by Israeli society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for questions and discussion.
Thank you for two wonderful papers. Question for Bar about your source base using missionary records. Firstly, a question about the access of the missionaries themselves to the community, and obviously the reception of the community of the missionaries, and then the reliability of their descriptions. So how do we know that what they're describing is particularly accurate or reliable?
Thanks you as well for a wonderful panel that actually, I think, put everything that we knew about the Ethiopian Jews in a totally another light. So I have two questions that I think both of them are about data, before we shift from one edge to another edge. So to David, I suppose it's quite clear why, in order to be integrated into Israeli society, you need to bring this card of victimness, etc. But could you, or do you have any data, which percentage of the Jews, young Jews, actually participated in these groups, how much it was common among them, etc., or were just able, let's say, to find the very few who actually participated? So is it a general thing or just and to Bar as a monastic, let's say, a phenomenon, of course, it's very intriguing. I think that you very well show the two sides, that it's Christians, it's similarity with Christianity, but on the other hand, the monks as the real guardians of Judaism, or kind of Judaism, among the Ethiopian Jews. But I would like maybe to learn a little bit more about your work as an archaeologist. You show us two different examples of a synagogue versus a Christian monastery. But nowadays, as an archaeologist, and how do you find these sites? How do you recognize them as synagogues? Because it seems that almost all of them were constructed from materials that do not stand the vicissitudes of time. So, thank you.
Okay.
Short question, very interesting panel. To David, I would like to add, I guess that most of those activists were from the urban population, Jewish population, and most of them were rural. So yes, that's important to know how many were living in the city. And the second question: did they try to promote communism in Israel, or to organize their own people to get their rights, or etc.?
היו שתי הרצאות מעולות, מטלטלות, תודה רבה לשניכם. אני שואל שאלה שמופנית לשניכם, שניכם בעצם באים מבחוץ, גם אתם באים מהאקדמיה, גם בגלל צבע העור שלכם, אתם לא בני הקהילה. יש מבני הקהילה אנשים שמספרים את הסיפורים האלה? ואני אשאל עוד שאלה שקשורה לזה, מה אתם חושבים אפשר או ראוי שיעשה הציבור הלא אתיופי בישראל כדי להדהד יותר את הדברים הללו כמרכיבים לא רק לגיטימיים בזהות של יוצאי אתיופיה, אלא אולי גם כמרכיבים שהם בעלי משמעות עבורנו?
Really transforming my own understanding. Thank you. My question is for David. The political activists, did that narrative got suppressed for real political reasons in the exiting out of Ethiopia? That it wasn't just bringing to Israel and there was a narrative there, but actually leaving involved suppressing the political story for reasons relating to the Sochnut, for reasons relating to the Ethiopian government, if there maybe was some real political agenda behind that.
I'd like to follow that question and to ask regarding the Sudanese. As we now know, approximately 30% or maybe even 40% of the Jews fleeing from Ethiopia via Sudan didn't make the trip. And the whole Mivtza Moshe, the Moshe operation actually was materialized because of a very problematic situation, political situation in Sudan. Can we explain some of the persecutions against the Beta Israel in Sudan regarding political conditions there? Meaning maybe they knew something about the political activists and were they looking for them?
The Sudanese...
Yeah, so did they have any links with the Ethiopian political figures and movements?
השאלה שלי לבר, יש לפחות שני רבנים ראשיים בישראל שהתייחסו לשאלת יהדותם של האתיופים. הראשון אולי היה הרב יצחק אייזק הלוי הרצוג, שפסק שהם לא יהודים בכלל, ויש למען האמת אפילו היום גם לא מעט מחקרים שתומכים בדבר הזה, שהם בעצם סוג של פלג מהכנסייה הנוצרית, האתיופית. וכולם מכירים את מה שהמהפך שעשה הרב עובדיה יוסף, שהוא מאמץ בעצם את שיטת הרדב"ז, שהם יודעים לכל דבר, ואפילו לא צריכים גיור לחומרה, מה שהיה מעין פתרון סינתטי כזה, כדי לצאת ידי חובת כל הדעות. אני מוכרח להודות שההרצאה שלך היממה אותי בזהות בין נוצרות, בין נזירות נוצרית, לבין נזירות יהודית אתיופית. אין כזאת נזירות ביהדות. שום רמז לדבר כזה לא נמצא, וגם אם נאמר שאין להם את הספרות של מה שנקרא תורה שבעל פה, שגם שם אין שום רמז לנזירות כזאת שהיא ממש מתנזרת מן העולם. גם אם נאמר שהמקורות שלהם הם מקורות יהודיים תנ"כיים, אין שם רמז לנזירות כזאת. השאלה שלי איך הם מסבירים לעצמם נזירות שכזאת, שיותר מדי מזכירה נזירות נוצרית. זה לא זהות יהודית ever never. לכן טוב שהיא נשכחה, אני שמח ואני אשמח אם היא תישאר רק בכותלי החדר הזה, כי אין שום קשר ליהדות והנזירות האתיופית הזאת. אז מעניין אותי איך הם מסבירים את זה לעצמם.
אני מקווה שלא. קודם כל תודה רבה באמת על שתי הרצאות מרתקות, מעניינות, מחדשות הרבה. כן, אמרתי, מצטרף לכל אלה שהודו על שתי הרצאות במושב מאוד מאוד מיוחד. יכול להיות שלא עקבתי טוב, ואני מתכוון להתייחס לצד המתודולוגי דוד. לא ברור לי כמה אנשים השתתפו ברעיונות, איזה סוג של רעיונות אלה היו. אני רוצה לקבל איזושהי תמונה, בכל זאת אתה מצייר משהו מאוד מאוד מיוחד, אבל הייתי רוצה שתעמיד אותו בפרופורציה גם, שתגיד לנו מה היה המסגרת, כמה אנשים השתתפו ברעיונות הללו, מי ניהל את הרעיונות הללו, ומה היה אופיים גם.
שאלות הן לדוד. האם יש לך גם מקורות חיצוניים שמהם לא רק אותם רעיונות אישיים עם אותם אנשים, אלא שהסיפורים שלהם נתמכים בכלל על ידי מקורות אחרים? כי אחרת זה מאוד מאוד צר. והשאלה השנייה היא, האם, אני מבקש קודם כל לראות שהבנתי, הם בעצם שם משתתפים לא בשם איזושהי ראייה לאומית אתיופית, אלא עבור רעיונות קוסמופוליטיים. נכון, אנושיים כלליים. האם אין בזה סוג של ויתור על הזהות היהודית? זאת אומרת, מה יהודי פה? זאת אומרת, מה החשיבות כאן בקטע הזה? האם ההשתתפות הזאת היא לא מעידה דווקא על סוג של פרישה?
לא, זהו, מספיק, אין זמן, הם צריכים לענות. יש להם 5 דקות לענות, זה
אוקיי, בסדר, זה יהיה אתגר לנסות לענות על השאלות במסגרת מגבלות הזמן. Maybe I should switch to English because that was the language of the talk. First of all, about the sources of the London Society for Promotion of Christianity amongst the Jews. The missionaries of that society were far from objective, and they usually made no attempt to hide that in their sources. They were opposed to the monks for several reasons. One, because they were opposed to the Jewish religion, another because they were Protestant and opposed to the Institute of Monasticism, and also because they found themselves coming in contact with many of the monks and discussing theological issues, so they viewed the monks as a threat. So the sources can't be seen as an objective description of Beta Islam monasticism, but it can be seen as a very thorough description, because the missionaries came in contact with the monks almost on a daily basis, and they talk about specific instances. They go to a certain monastery, they meet a certain monk, and this and that happened. They're, I think, the most detailed source, and definitely the most widespread source. The missionaries published a journal, and they would publish their what happened on their different journeys throughout the year, so you can trace their meetings with the monks throughout a very extended period of time. So if I deal with the practicalities of monasticism rather than maybe the idea of monasticism, the sources, I think, are very good and very thorough. Regarding the archaeological aspect of the monastery, I have to say that when before the first trip, and when thinking about this idea for PhD studies, I was a bit afraid because the monasteries, at least as reflected in the sources, were not very big. There were usually a few huts surrounded by an enclosure wall, and in Ethiopia, traditional huts are built or partially built out of organic material. In addition to that, usually the information given states the name of a village near where the monastery was. Sometimes the names change over the years. So what you usually get is a general area within which you have to identify the Beta Israel village, within which you have to identify the monastery. But the plus in this type of work, and that's maybe different from archaeological research in other places in the world, is that most of the monasteries that are mentioned in the sources, and the sources are mostly 19th, 20th century sources, were only abandoned. Remember, the monasteries can take you to the actual site. And what happened in December was we visited 2 sites, and in both cases we met with the people, and they took us to see the remains of the synagogue and the remains of the cemetery and so on. And for me it was a big surprise, but there are stone foundations of these, of at least the major structures in the Beta Israel village. So put together, all of that can enable archaeological work and the drawing out of plans of what the village looked like and hopefully what the monastery looked like within or near the village. Regarding the memories of these things within the Beta Israel community, I hope I remembered the question correctly. It depends on who you ask. The elders of the Beta Israel community, especially those who had a religious function, remember Beta Israel monasticism and its common knowledge. The younger generation doesn't remember monasticism that much, and usually when I speak about monasticism with people who are young and maybe not connected to a family of religious standing, at first they oppose the idea. They don't believe that such a thing could happen. And this is partially because of the meeting between the Beta Israel and representatives of Orthodox Judaism who sometimes criticized Beta Israel Judaism, and that has to do with the last question. So many Beta Israel feel that their Judaism is constantly being criticized, and that they have to prove that they are as Jewish as other people. So sometimes the new generation doesn't learn as much about the original traditions of the Beta Israel as at least I would hope that they would learn. Two questions, and I think they're a bit connected. And I think here we're moving to from the topic of research to the topic of maybe public awareness and public ideology. And I know it's very difficult to separate between the two when dealing with an issue like the heritage of Beta Israel. I'll tell you my personal view, and it's more of a view that comes from ideology than a view that comes from research. I think that unfortunately, in my view, there is very little tolerance within Judaism to people who have different tradition. The Beta Israel, usually when people from the general public hear about them for the first time, they ask questions regarding their Judaism and try to think, are they really Jewish? And I think that the Beta Israel having to deal with that has caused lots of their heritage not to be passed to the new generation, and lots of their heritage not to be preserved by Israeli society for the future. I think a fascinating phenomenon like monasticism that has a Jewish identity and preserves a Jewish way of life, and I know that the sentence that I said right now doesn't really, could be criticized also by the academic community, but this phenomenon is a fascinating phenomenon, and it deserves to be remembered for future generation. And the same goes for many other aspects of Beta Israel traditional life. These are things that happened, and the Beta Israel, regardless of their origin, and I'm not getting into the issue of their origin, they did carry with them a Jewish identity, and they did have to work hard to preserve that identity from exterior challenges. And I think their heritage is valid and should be remembered as it was, and not reshaped as what we view or what is viewed that Judaism should be. And I think that the Ethiopian Jewish existence has a potential to maybe change, first of all, it has a potential to change the view of Israeli society of the Jews of Ethiopia. The fact that they had monastic leadership standing with lots of nice traditions about them, and also the fact that they had, at least parts of them had independence from Christian rule for some time periods. They waged battles with Christian kings. It's a different type of history, and it's a history that inspired Jewish communities all over the world in the late Middle Ages, so I see no reason why it can't inspire general Israeli society today.
טוב, אני אתייחס, אני אקבץ, ראשית אני אענה באנגלית, אני אקבץ כמה שאלות ביחד לגבי, כמובן, שאלה של המספרים או הרפרזנטטיביות, עד כמה זה... תראו, אני בינתיים עשיתי 17 רעיונות עומק, כן? זה לא נשמע הרבה, אבל צריך להתייחס לזה כקצה הקרחון בלבד, לדעתי. ראשית, אני התייחסתי רק לשני...
זה לא מעט. זה לא מעט.
ייתכן. כל סיפור הוא כמובן עולם בפני עצמו, אבל ראשית, אני התרכזתי בינתיים בשני ארגונים, גם מתוכם אני לא מיציתי את כל המרואיינים. אחד המרואיינים ציין שלמשל מה-TPLF יש בישראל לדעתו למעלה מ-200, יש ארגון של יוצאי TPLF בישראל שמונה 87 אנשים שהם רשומים והם פעילים TPLF בלבד. היו ארגונים נוספים, EDU, EPLF, אני יודע בוודאות שהיו יהודים שהשתתפו שם, אבל עוד לא הגעתי אליהם. וגם היה את הצד השני של הדרג, שאותה חונטה צבאית, היא לא ראתה את עצמה כחונטה צבאית, היא ראתה את עצמה כאיזשהו אוונגרד סוציאליסטי, והיא גייסה אנשים, ואנשים התגייסו. דווקא רוב, מבחינה מספרית, יהודים או ביתא ישראל או פלאש, איך שלא תקראו להם, היו דווקא מגויסים לדרג, והם גם חלק מאותה אתיופיה מהפכנית, Revolutionary Ethiopia. מבחינת, אז אני חושב שהתשובה הקצרה לשאלה כמה הם היו מבחינה מספרית, התשובה הכי נכונה שאני יכול לתת, לא שונה מקבוצות אחרות. זאת התשובה הנכונה. בכל אתיופיה זה לא היו כולם, הרוב היו, אתה יודע, כפריים שאולי ידעו חלק, אולי השתתפו במשהו, אבל הפעילים, וכשמסתכלים ככה, סטטיסטיקה מאוד מאוד נאיבית, הערכה שאני קראתי אצל אחד החוקרים, אנדלקצ'או מקונן, הוא מעריך שבאתיופיה המהפכנית, Revolutionary Ethiopia, זה מושג כזה, השתתפו משהו כמו 300,000 איש בטוטל, שזה מתוך מדינה של 30 מיליון דאז. הקהילה של ביתא ישראל שמנתה אז משהו כמו 30-40 אלף, המספר המקביל יהיה 300-400, אני חושב שהמספר שם עבר בהרבה את זה, ולא בכדי. אני יודע שאותן קבוצות מהפכניות הם דווקא חיפשו את קבוצות השוליים כדי לגייס מהם אנשים, כמו ביתא ישראל, הקמנט, ממחוז גומוז, הם חיפשו את אלה החלשים שלא היה להם מה להפסיד, והם יהיו פעילים ולוחמים יותר מחויבים. אז זה לגבי המספר. את שאלת כאן האם הם היו ברובם אורבנים, לא, הם היו ברובם באו מהכפרים, הם הצטרפו למה שנקרא הזרוע הצבאית של ה-EPRP או הזרוע הצבאית של ה-TPLF שגייסו אנשים מהכפרים, זה היה בדרך כלל הפרופיל שלהם, חלקם כן גויסו במהלך הלימודים שלהם בשכבות הגיל הגבוהות יותר, שהם כן למדו בערים, אבל קשה לכנות אותם ממש עירוניים. נשאלה פה שאלה, האם אלו סיפורים שגם הם עצמם מספרים? אלו סיפורים שהם עצמם מספרים. אני פה זאת אומרת, לא המצאתי שום דבר משל עצמי. מה שכן, זה מאוד מאוד מתכתב ותורם לספרות הכללית שיש על התקופה המהפכנית באתיופיה. המפלגות והתנועות והמאבק ומלחמת האזרחים, הדברים מאוד מאוד מתכתבים. כמובן בסיפורים יש אי דיוקים לפעמים, או הזיכרון קצת בוגד, או שאנשים מנסים קצת לייפות את הזיכרון, אבל הדברים במהותם מתמחים לחלוטין על ידי הספרות. זה שאנחנו בחרנו עד היום ככה לא לעשות את החיבור בין השניים, זאת קצת הבעיה ואני מנסה פה לתקן אותה. את שאלת שם, you asked about whether there was a political agenda behind this abandonment. Well, it was the days, we need to remember the 80s, the days of the Cold War. There was a sort of right-wing government in Israel, and communists were not welcome. Although, if they looked deeply into this, they would realize that they were not the Soviet-type communists. They were the ones fighting against the Derg that was supported by the Soviets. They were Marxists, because Marxism for them meant democracy and freedom, etc. But they weren't the type of communists that you should be afraid of, but this is how it went down. אתה שאלת שם, צחי, לגבי ממשלת סודאן ומה שהיא עשתה במחנות. טוב, זה סיפור קצת מורכב, אני יודע שהיו מגעים של ה-EPRP כשהם הרגישו שהם נוחלים תבוסה, להתקבל לסודאן כתנועה פוליטית או כצבא מהפכני ולהתארגן שם מחדש. מי שהכשיל את זה בסופו של דבר היו ה-EPLF, האריתראים, מכל מיני סיבות של פוליטיקה שלא ניכנס אליהם, אבל הם פשוט נקלטו שם כפליטים והיו צריכים לשרוד כאחרון הפליטים בתנאים מאוד מאוד קשים. לא זכור לי, אני לא שמעתי על רדיפות של ממשלת סודאן בתוך המחנות, אבל יכול להיות. האם יש מקורות חיצוניים שהסיפורים שלהם נתמכים? אני ציינתי, יש ספרות שלמה וענפה על אתיופיה המהפכנית, שבהחלט מתכתבת עם הסיפורים האלה. ולגבי השאלה פה אני קצת יכול ברשותכם לעשות אולי copy-paste ממה שבר אמר לגבי מה יהודי בזה. ברשותכם אני חושב שהשאלה צריכה להיות מופנית אלינו. מה זה אומר עלינו? שאנחנו שומעים על צעירים אידיאליסטים שמוכנים לחיות ולמות, צריך לומר, על אידיאלים של חופש, שוויון וסולידריות עם הסובבים אותם, ואנחנו רואים בזה איזה משהו בעייתי. מה זה אומר עלינו כחברה? תודה רבה.
תודה רבה. המסקנה משתי הרצאות, במיוחד מהרצאה של דוידי, שכל זיכרון, כל נרטיב הוא בעצם לא רק זיכרון, אלא גם שכחה והוא מעשה פוליטי בסופו של דבר. תודה רבה, וגן שהפסקה ללנץ'.